Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of this Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Francesca Trivellato, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of History at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. And we'll be discussing her second book, I think it's second book, called The Promise and Peril of Credit: What a Forgotten Legend About Jews and Finance Tells Us About the Making of European Commercial Society. This is published by Princeton University Press. So thank you, Professor Trivellato, for joining me once again.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back here with you.
So my pleasure. And so over the summer we had emailed, we were talking perhaps about doing a podcast episode on this book, and then I forgot it along with other things I had to take care of. And then recently with the whole, current events with Kanye or Ye, whatever he goes by, and then the anti-Semitic, remarks and from others. So this was something of a, I guess, time appropriate, unfortunately, to discuss.
Yeah, sadly, these are timely and current problems, although they have a very long history, and we wish that they'll go away at some point, but they seem to be still with us.
Right, unfortunately. So, but however, you wrote this book a few years ago, and you researched it for many years before that. So that's not how you came to this. How did you come to such a topic, into this book?
Yeah, so the topic of the book is a new angle in the very long history of the relationship between Jews and capitalism, less the real relationship than the imagined and distorted relation between Jews and capitalism. And it's something that I had been interested in for a long time, and it is a topic about which I thought there was virtually nothing new to say. And as proof of how entrenched the problem is, particularly in the European Christian imaginary, though today in a much more global imaginary, chances was that I encountered more than a wrinkle in this long story that had been forgotten by both academic historians and the larger public. And I delve into it. So the book, as I said, was partially the result of a longstanding interest and partly the result of a chance encounter. I was rereading a very well-known merchant manual of the 17th century, was printed in France in 1675, and virtually every economic historian of Europe has read part of this. It's called The Perfect Merchant. The Perfect Trader is sort of a manual about to trade, but also about how to give dignity to merchants. And in a chapter that I had never seen quoted, which is its title, The Importance and the Origins of Bills of Exchange. It says that bills of exchange had been invented by Jews in the Middle Ages. And I just, sort of jumped at my chair because it had been, a good many years I had been doubling down in this topic, and I had not encountered this story, and this is a very, very legitimate source. And so I decided to go down this rabbit hole and see what will come out. And it turned out that a whole new universe of ideas about Jews and capitalism, came out of this rabbit hole. And I was able, so I speak of this as a forgotten legend, and it's been forgotten. It's a legend because it's not true. The Jews invented bills of exchange, and we'll talk about what that means and what they are. But it's been forgotten in the second half of the 20th century. But until World War II, a lot of people had discussed the allegorical meaning of this wrong idea, this fake news, we could call it, using a sadly very current expression.
Okay, so we'll get a little bit into, like you said, bills of exchange and that type of thing. I want to ask you a general question, though. You mentioned you found it in this book that was directed at merchants, and so just could you generally explain that for the listeners? Like, what does that mean? I mean, France is, I guess you said it was French. Everyone read French. I mean, it was France, they considered the power. And what does it mean, like books for merchants, trade?
Yes.
Give some general background.
So two things. First, France is, between 1500 and the French Revolution, 1789, is the largest feudal monarchy of Europe. And so it's usually associated with large landed estate. But beginning in the 17th, and then particularly in the 18th century, France is also a very powerful mercantile empire. If there's French spoken in the Caribbean today, is because of the colonization and the plantation system and the forced transportation of African labor the French did in part of the Caribbean. There's still some regions of the Caribbean that are called the territoire d'outre-mer, overseas territories, that are part of the French state. So Saint-Domingue and Haiti were the two largest, sugar islands. And so France had a very important role in the Atlantic, both in the slave trade and in the so-called cash crops, the sugar plantations. And merchant manuals, they go back to the Middle Ages. They are same like, with artisan manuals. These are a complicated genre. They are books in which the author usually promises to reveal the secrets of a certain profession, and therefore lays out a lot of practical information. However, the practical knowledge tends to be very difficult to be explained in words. And, so formal and informal apprenticeship remained very important. So these how-to books, how to become a good merchant, it's not exactly clear to historians how much importance they had in the real education of a merchant. But they certainly had concomitantly another function, which was to legitimize, to validate the value, the utility, and the honorability, I use this word on purpose, of these professions in a culture, in a feudal culture that tend to disdain manual labor and practical knowledge. So honor, before the French Revolution, is an adjective that is traditionally associated with the nobility. The nobility inherits, usually from father to son, sometimes from mother to son, depends on the system, but inherits the quality of honor, sort of in some transcendental, it's passed on through blood, while what at the time were called the mechanical arts. Therefore, both artisanal and financial and commercial knowledge was something that was considered dishonorable. So these merchant manuals, particularly these ones of the 17th century, also had a learned preface in which they explained that merchants were actually very useful to society and that they should be treated with a certain, considerations, and that they were indeed. There's even one that is called the honorable merchant, and that adjective is chosen on purpose. So the two functions, the sort of the practical and the cultural, are inseparable. And that is important for our conversations because these, frankly, completely wacko ideas about Jews are found not in the kind of literature of which there were plenty of examples of, friars and theologians who would rail violently against Jews or killers of Christ or that kind of religious nature anti-Semitism. But these wacko ideas about Jews are found in the very literature that tries to give a positive foundation to trade. Okay, that's very important. These are authors who don't have prejudice against commerce. They have prejudice against Jews, and we'll see how the two things can go together. If you look at the religious, ecclesiastical Christian literature, you find all sorts of other things, but that is very important.
Yeah, and the Christian literature could have issues with commerce and usury, especially. We'll get to that later on. Right. So this is specifically these merchant handbooks. Okay. So you mentioned in the beginning, before we get to the exact handbooks, we'll discuss what's going on over here. So the first thing is marine insurance. This is something also they accuse the Jews of. What is that? Why it was used, how it was used. I guess let's give a background to that.
Yeah. So this legend says that Jews invented both marine insurance and bills of exchange when they were expelled from France in the Middle Ages. So as ways. They created these inventions, so they devised these inventions so as to put their own assets and money in, to protect them from expropriation. So marine insurance is exactly what we mean by insurance today. So it is what sometimes we call, you go to law school, so you probably know these things better than me. It's called premium insurance. Right? If you buy an insurance on your house, you pay a certain premium, and depending on how the premium is, then you can have a higher coverage or a lower coverage. Or our healthcare system today in the United States, the private healthcare system, you pay a monthly premium, and if you pay $100, you have very low coverage. If you pay $2,000 a month, you have very high coverage. This premium insurance is an invention of the 15th century in Italy. There were forms of insurance or forms of dividing risks from antiquity, but it was not the premium insurance. So before, there were other ways of mitigating risks of trade and of travel. And so it's a very clever thing, and it's a novelty. It's a novelty of the 15th century. This is what historians know, but these guys in the 17th century weren't quite sure. And so they claimed that it had been, because it's so clever, and it had been Jews who had invented marine insurance in the sense of modern insurance.
Okay, so that's one. So you're saying they claimed it because then they left France and they were expelled at to transfer the money. So then we get to bills of exchange. And these are discussed at length.
Much more complicated. So while marine insurance is the same, what was invented in the 15th century, it's exactly the same scheme and principle as it exists today. Bills of exchange are both much more complicated, and they don't exist anymore. But between the 13th century and throughout the 19th and early 20th century, they were the most important paper instrument of credit and remittances, that is, payments for long distance trade. So bills of exchange are physically small slips of papers, kind of smaller or thinner than a modern, what you and I have a personal check. We don't use checkbooks very much, but most of us still have. You're very young, but I still have a checkbook for the rare occasions. So they're smaller than that, and they are. There's a kind of a language in which, like on a check, there's a technical language in which you order certain financial operations. So there's sentences that are abbreviated and technical. And there are ways in which a merchant orders someone in one place to pay a certain amount of money in another location in a different currency. So the marvel of these bills of exchange is that they are at the same time a check and a money order. So they are both an instrument of credit, because they say the transaction occurs today, but the payment will to the person, between X and Y, the person Z will be paid in the future, because this is, remember, we are operating before the Industrial Revolution, before the telegraph, before the airplane. So to transfer a piece of information, you need a human being, a ship, or a donkey to carry the piece of information from place A to place B, okay? Information does not travel faster than human beings until the telegraph is invented in the middle of the 19th century. So credit is involved by definition because if you order the payment in a distant city, it has to occur in a future moment. At the same time, the same instrument is also an instrument of currency exchange because the payment will occur. This is a time where, it's like Europe before the Euros and much more. Every little city, every little town, there'll be plenty of different currencies being valid and utilized in different places. And so the beauty of these instruments called bills of exchange is they can allow for payment in foreign currency. So you can buy products. If you're in Florence, you want to buy some special woolen cloth from Flanders, you can pay it in the Flemish guilds instead of the Florentine Florence. The third characteristic, and I'll be very brief and will return, is that after the 16th century, after around 1500s, these bills of exchange, because they're also currency conversion instruments, they also begin to be used by some as purely speculative instruments. And we'll talk about the difference between commerce, that is the purchase and sale at distance of commodities, and finance, which is the purchase and sale of money in of themselves. So they are a beautiful, important, complicated, and to non-expert, very opaque instruments. The fact that they're made of paper makes them very immaterial, and yet they carry so much value. And the fact that they are written in this very technical language makes it difficult for, it's like today, like a lot of us have pensions invested in very complicated financial instruments that none of us understand how they work. We want them to perform well so that at some point we'll be able to retire. But we are also very worried because we don't understand the intricacies of these financial operations. And therefore, we can always worry, and I think it sometimes happens, that there's some clique of financiers who know how to profit over our retirement investment, for example. So I think the analogy is not perfect, but the way in which ordinary people and even experts like some of the authors of these manuals who were lawyers but not merchants themselves, they felt that these bills of exchange could potentially be very beneficial, but were also so hard to grapple with that could also be very scary.
So I'll mention it here. I'm going to put a link in the show's notes to the book, but if you see the book's cover, you can see on the top of on the cover already, there is bills of exchange there. So if you want to see what they look like, just click on that link and you will see.
Yeah, just look on Amazon. And as you said, the cover is precisely to send a tangible impression of what these piles of little pieces of paper might look like. And there's a lot of value, a lot of money is being transferred in this impalpable way.
Yeah, and then it's more in the book. I mean, so how important were these? And another thing also is, I don't know if you mentioned this, I mean, is this the case also that it made it easier to transfer money? If people had to transfer large sums of money, instead of being, suspect to robberies and to pirates, you just...
That's exactly right. So they began because, during the 12th and particularly the 13th century, the 1200s, there is an economic revival in Europe. It's sometimes called the medieval commercial revolution. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, there had been a period of economic and demographic decline. So there is this economic revival, and new goods are being transported across the Mediterranean and across of Europe. A particularly important commodity trade center were the fairs of Champagne, which is a town, it's a region in eastern France, northeastern France, today at the border with Germany. And these fair of Champagne were a magnet for merchants from all over Europe, including Italian merchants who were among the most skilled. And in order to, instead, as you said, normally in order to buy the goods at the Fair of Champagne, you would have to, put a sack of coins on the back of a horse, and then there'll be, corrupt custom officers and bandits, and simply you get stuck on the Alps and there's a snowstorm. There are plenty of risks. Or if you board a ship, say from Pisa to Marseille, you may run into pirates or have a shipwreck. So with these paper instruments, because they are not money, okay, this is very important. They're not money. Somebody steal your money, they can do whatever they want unless they get caught, right? These bills of exchange are, as we said, a combination of personal checks and money orders. So they are addressed from person X to person Y. So if you steal a bill of exchange and you're not the intended beneficiary, you cannot cash it. So it solves the two problems at once, because they're paper, they're easy to travel, they don't have material, intrinsic, metallic value. And at the same time, they're not, unlike money, they're not transferable to anyone. And so they make, so initially these Italian merchants developed these paper instruments to transfer funds to their agents. They pay an agent to stay at the Fair of Champagne, and they send them money in this way.
So, I mean, and you said these were very influential at this time. And just to skip ahead, I mean, until when were these really used? Until when? Because you said today no one really knows of them anymore.
Yeah, in fact, they were used, I'm told, by specialists even as late as the 1980s by the Bank of England. But generally, they were used through the interwar period until before World War II. And there's an Andrzej Wajda movie about industrialization in a Polish town, in which there is a theme with the Jewish investors and non-Jewish investors, and they try to, and this is the early 19th century, and they try to raise all this money, and then it all goes into flame because they're just paper instruments. And so there's in the 19th century, there are a lot of novels. If somebody reads, for example, the British Victorian novels, they're full of mention of bills of exchange. So they're very ordinary instruments throughout the 19th century in particular.
Okay. So as you mentioned, there's a legend that came out, and you've already alluded to it. It's obviously not from the Jews, it's from other people. We'll get to where it was, when it was invented, by who, but you mentioned the manual that you found, but there really is another. There was a French guy, I'm going to butcher his name, so I'll let you read it, that you found afterwards, that he was really the first kind of source on this. And you discussed this in depth in the book. I
discussed this in depth because this was somebody who was extremely influential in the 17th century, and that we, modern academic scholars, have forgotten about. And so it's also to correct a certain anachronism of, you think about the history of European economic thought, you think about Adam Smith and some very big names, but there were others who we have forgotten, but were influential at the time. This was a lawyer, not a merchant himself. He was a lawyer in the French town of Bordeaux, which is in the south of France, and that matters for the history of Jews. We'll come back. And he writes a compilation of maritime and commercial laws and adds comments to them. Now, this topic, maritime and commercial law, in the 17th century is not taught in law schools. And there are few authors who treat it in Latin to give it some, pedigree. So this is a very innovative treatise. This lawyer's name is Ètienne Cleirac, Cleirec. Not that anybody has ever heard of him, I'm sure. But it's very innovative because he writes these treaties in vernacular French. And it goes back to what I was saying before, that France is beginning to expand in the Atlantic. So he realizes that there are a lot of lawsuits that are happening in courts that concern, payments of sailors, or how to, disputes over marine insurance and bills of exchange, precisely. And the judges are not trained. They don't really know how to adjudicate these disputes. And so he wants to give them a compilation of norms and explain to them how to address it. And also this treatise, which is published in 1647, but then republished 5 times in very high print runs for the time. So we know that it was very widely read, and a section of it was even translated into English. These treatises, as I was saying before, this particular one belongs to this genre that was not at all a condemnation. In fact, the opposite. It was a guide to how to legitimize merchants and those who pursue trade and banking in this feudal society. So it's very affirming of the importance of credit and commerce. And the funny thing, well, it's not funny, I don't know, but it is striking, is that he's quite learned. He has a lot of citations, both from legal sources and from a lot of literature, a lot of religious Christian texts. Is a very devout Catholic and pro-monarchic guy. The only inaccurate source in this 500 plus page treatise is the one that attributes to Jews the invention of marine insurance and bills of exchange. This lawyer says that he found this information in what is a famous chronicle of medieval Florence, written by someone by the name of Giovanni Villani, who died of the Black Death in Florence in 1348. And this source mentions nothing about Jews. Although this source was, this chronicle, this Florentine chronicle, had a description of an alleged miracle that had occurred supposedly in 1250 Paris, which is called the miracle of the consecrated host, which is a very anti-Semitic story about a Jewish pawnbrokers throwing the Eucharist into the fire and the Eucharist bleeding. And it was a miracle that was used in order to teach Catholics about this idea of transubstantiation, which was and is very difficult to grapple even for believers. So this source, as I said, it's inaccurate. It's the only inaccurate source in a very learned treatise. But there is an association, and sort of that's one of our theme, between religious anti-Semitism and this very practical commercial knowledge. The two things still went hand in hand.
So, I mean, especially here, you're saying that this, read the book, and this is like his only inaccurate thing. You went to the original source. It's not there. So where did he kind of get it from? He just invented it, and obviously we don't know why, but to any extent that you've researched this, I mean, why did he go about, was he just anti-Semitic? He wanted to just go after the Jews in this? What was the reason that you could discern?
Yes, this is the $1 million question. And in fact, there are two questions that you're asking, Ahi, and one, it's easier to, what was he trying to get at? And I think that my book is the interpretation, but where did he get it, this idea? It's very hard to know. There might have been an oral legend circulating. He may have come up with it. What we know is that this idea emerged in Bordeaux, or at least went to print for the first time in the middle of the 17th century in Bordeaux, which is a very peculiar environment in the history of the Jews. It is not very well known, but it's very important. Bordeaux and the surrounding area between 1550 and 1723 is the only area of Europe where Jews who flee the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal are allowed to live not as Jews, only as Catholics. But in France, there is no Inquisition. And so they're not actively persecuted for their presumed so-called crypto-Judaism. So in 1550, the King of France invites Jews who are fleeing the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal to come and settle in the area of Bordeaux, not in all of France, from where Jews had been expelled long before. And he says, you can live here as Portuguese merchants. That's the euphemism in the law. And everybody knows that a number of them, may maintain some degree of knowledge or ritual habits linked to Judaism. They also intermarry with Catholics, some intermarry among themselves. But, and we'll go back to it, they're kind of like invisible Jews. That's an important point. So I think that Cleirac, the author of this treatise in which this legend is first committed to the printed page, lives in an environment which is very rare in Europe, where there is neither assimilation nor the ghetto, in which there are, in the mercantile community around him, Jews who are not identifiable as Jews, but everybody knows or suspects they're Jewish. So there's a circumstantial sets of reasons why I think this association between Jews and bills of exchange emerged then and there. What does it mean? And this is very important, is the pedagogical purpose of this legend is not to condemn the Jews. There are plenty of condemnations of Jews in all Christian Catholic culture. The real targets of these legends are these honorable merchants of Bordeaux who have to be careful. They should use marine insurance and bills of exchange because thanks to these new financial instruments, commerce develops to everyone's benefits. However, they should be careful because if these financial instruments were invented by Jews, they are by definition tainted by the by their Jewish origin. And so since it's very difficult for a lawyer in the 17th century to say legally when and how a merchant uses marine insurance and bills of exchange in ways that are legitimate and legal and beneficial, and when he uses in ways that are only to his own personal profit and maybe, what we call today, rapacious lending and shark loans and that kind of sort of things, the way these fears are expressed through this legend is to say, if you don't handle this financial instruments correctly, and we don't know what correctly really means, then you become Jewish. That is, you are handling them as if you were a Jew, which is the worst insult in this kind of society. So as you were hinting at, the target of this allegorical stories are the Christian merchants, and Jews are just stand-in symbolically for everything that is potentially negative in a commercial society and potentially dangerous and also difficult to detect. That's very important. So the theme of invisibility and difficulty of detecting, which are the potentially dangerous way of handling financial instruments, they go together.
Okay, first of all, if anyone's interested, Bordeaux is Bordeaux. If anyone wants to check up, exactly where it is and anything about it.
Absolutely, yes, it's the same name today.
Yeah, Bordeaux. So okay, so as you're saying, this first of all, the Jews is like, as we say, make it treif. It's like, oh, Jews is bad, So was this only? So you're saying it wasn't only directed at Jews; they were more of like a stand-in, and it also was non-Jews as well. And in the book, you kind of discuss this, how there were definitely non-Jewish merchants, Italians, and others. I forget the phrase, that they also were engaged in these kind of things that he was like directing at. And then something, you mentioned this theme of Jewish invisibility. So that's something that really comes up.
Yes. Well, I was saying that this book began with an interest on the relationship between Jews and capitalism. Now, capitalism is a lot of things. So this particular legend about which we had lost, the sense of importance, but that was very widespread at the time, goes to the heart of a particular feature of financial capitalism, which is its abstraction. The fact that these paper instruments can transfer value across the space, they can convert currency and do this all in invisible ways. And this is different from commerce as saying, I want to buy a nice silk brocade, and I myself produce a nice glass vase, and then I trade these commodities, of which you need expertise to assess the value and the price, but they're tangible. Okay, so bills of exchange become associated with this abstract financial capitalism, of which there is the first instantiation in the 16th century in Europe. There are fairs, the most famous ones in another French city, in Lyon, along the river Loire, that along the river Rhône, I got the wrong river, in these fairs, instead of buying and selling commodities, a small group of bankers buy and sell paper instruments. There is a stock market in Amsterdam and London. This is different from the stock market, but it's sort of the same idea, that it's transaction of abstract value that they're not objects, they're not things that you can buy or goods you can feed yourself. It's not food. They're not metal plates. They're not clothing. They're not even pieces of furniture. They're neither luxury nor essential goods. It's pure speculative finance. And this becomes a reality, this separation between what we call today the real economy and the financial economy begins in the 16th century. And so there's an association between Jewish invisibility and the invisibility of these financial transactions. And I think that Jewish invisibility is a very odd concept for probably many of our readers. When you think about Christian Europe in the past, you probably think about ghettos with doors, and you can enter and exit. As Jews are certainly not invisible, they're segregated. People may think about a certain kind of racist physiognomy, Jews being depicted with certain facial traits that make them very distinguishable, but these are the two examples I gave: segregation, for example, in urban residents, and physiognomical traits attributed to Jews are Christian responses to the fear, the deep theological fear that Jews become indistinguishable from Christians. As everybody knows, the first Christians were Jews who converted to Christianity. And some of them did not convert fully, or at least they converted fully in their hearts. I'm agnostic about that. But just because as every human beings, we tend to be a little, traditional and carry on with our habits, some at least of the early Jewish converts to Christianity continued, for example, to fast on certain Jewish holidays, or to carry on some of their traditions. That was very threatening to Christianity as the new religion, and created this idea that among our midst of Christians, there may be some Jews who claim to have converted, but are not fully converted. This fear became gigantic once the Inquisition began to force Jews, more or less coercively, to convert to Christianity. The goal of Christianity is to convert all Jews, but once Jews are converted, Christians don't believe they've really converted. This is the kernel of this difficult relationship, that the fear that Jews who accept nominally, or perhaps some of them even in some deeper way, a new faith, do not fully embrace the new faith. And Bordeaux, the city of Bordeaux, is the living example of this, because the legal arrangements under which Jews are allowed to live in Bordeaux is as Portuguese merchants. So they cannot be Jewish, so there's always a fear that they may be so-called crypto-Jews. Now, this in the context of a pre-modern society in which there is the Inquisition. But Jewish invisibility continues even in the modern period as a fear, because the French Revolution gives Jews the same civil and political rights. So Jews after 1991 in France become citizens. Citizenship is a bit like baptism. It eliminates your presumed earlier origin. Before baptism, you were a Jew, and now after baptism, you're a Christian. Before emancipation, you were first Jewish and second a resident of France. After emancipation, you are a citizen of France. But the non-Jewish citizens of France always worry. I'm like, are these Jewish citizens really loyal, or do they remain first Jewish? That is, are there invisible Jews among us? And so the kind of racialized racism that emerges in the 19th century is, to a large extent, a response, an aggressive, violent response by a supposedly secular, but really Christian Catholic society to emancipation, to the fear that Jews who are now equal citizens may not be fully loyal. And so we have to identify them through other means, because before emancipation, we put them in a ghetto. They had to go back at night. They had to, or we asked them to wear certain garments so they would be identifiable. And going back to Bordeaux, in Bordeaux, there is no ghetto. There are no special garments. So Jews move undetected among the rest of the merchants, kind of like these bills of exchange transfer in mysterious, undetectable ways sum of money from one place to another. So I think that is, it's not stated explicitly. That is my interpretation. That is the connection between Jews and bills of exchange. But as you were saying, this association doesn't mean to condemn Jews. I mean, no Christian at the time would have said particularly great and wonderful and positive things about the way in which Jews supposedly handle money. This association is a warning to Christian merchants that, okay, they are going to use these paper instruments because that enhances everyone's well-being, supposedly, by enhancing trade and making it easier to move money and mobile capital across political and geographical borders. But you have to do it with a kind of unspecified good Christian ethos. Otherwise, you're going to be like a Jew, which is the worst insult you can be the subject of.
So, I mean, some of what you said in towards the beginning of your answer there a few minutes ago was something we alluded to in the beginning. I don't know if you wanted to mention more about that, which is the definition of right credit. You mentioned there's a difference of finance and commerce. They're kind of two different things related. We just mentioned credit. So that's kind of what you were mentioning there, depending on if you're buying something tangible or speculative.
So exactly. So the Jews, for the most part, could not be part, for example, of artisanal guilds. In the pre-modern period, in order to produce manufacturing goods, in most parts of Europe, you had to be part of a guild, of a professional exclusive club, and baptism. Both in Lutheran and Calvinist and in Catholic society, baptism was one of the requirements. Being a man was usually one of the requirement, and not being a foreigner was one of the requirement. So these were, so Jews were mostly involved in either pawnbroking or high-end commerce, because in commerce, after around 1500, for international trade, there are no guilds. So you can be an international merchant as an individual, more or less. You don't have to be part of a guild. And so they are able to enter this sphere, not everywhere, just in a few, in Amsterdam, in Venice, in Livorno, in Bordeaux, later in London, with some exclusions, with some, in London, for example, with everybody thinks of London as the capital of trade and empire, and where the Industrial Revolution later happened. But there were a lot of limits of legal discrimination against which kind of Atlantic commerce and financial occupations Jews could occupy. And Amsterdam was more open, in fact. But all this to say that in order to conduct commerce in this period over long distances, it was necessary to use financial instruments because, as we said earlier, the distances could not be, you couldn't, press your app and transfer money with the Venmo or Zelle or things like that. You actually had to. It was complicated to carry both goods and remittances from one place to another. So the finance and trade on the one hand went together, but then this separation occurred where some bankers began to speculate on what today we call currency arbitrage. The fact that the exchange rates in two locations is different. And so they started to do that back in the 1500s. And those speculation had nothing to do with commodity. And that's where the association, which I argue, between the invisibility of finance and the invisibility of Jews in the mind of Christian observers became so entrenched.
Okay, there's something else that we didn't mention. It's discussed throughout the book. I don't know, if this is a little out of order, but we should mention usury, which is, ribis, usurious lending, and what that kind of meant. There's another kind of legend, or maybe it's not a legend, maybe, to some degree it's true, that the church didn't allow, Christians to, because the Chumash, the Bible doesn't let, so the Bible, they weren't allowed to, so they only let the Jews do it. But there are countless Christians, and there were, that did lend with usury, they were allowed to. There was kind of this shifting Christian perception definition. So this comes into play in the book as well. And, perhaps you want to just at least mention it here, even if we're a little out of order.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think perhaps some of our listeners will associate Jewish usury to somebody like Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, a very nefarious and shadow figure who actually demands as a pawn nothing less than a pound of human flesh. So usury is sometimes associated with Jews because, as you said, because of the passage in Leviticus that allows Jews to lend an interest to non-Jews or to strangers, but not to other Jews. They were seen as those who could lend to Christians. And that is accurate, that it's how the church organized the things for a lot of the Middle Ages. But I want to emphasize a particular point here, that that kind of usury tends, that's hence my reference to Shylock, to be associated with pawnbroking. That you maybe a poor Christian, you only have a few sheets or maybe a brass vase at home, and you are cash stripped and you need something to eat, and you bring it to a Jewish pawnbrokers, and they give you very few pennies, and they ask for very high interest rates. And that's sort of the image we have in our mind. And there's a lot of truth in the social reality of how things were organized in this image. But international trade in the 17th century did not involve any pawns. So the amazing things about these bills of exchange is that they were credit instruments between individuals who did not have to pawn. There was no collateral. The collateral was the reputation of the merchants in the form of his signature. I know that this sounds very abstract, but it is important precisely because it points to this level of abstract finance. So when a merchant, say in Bordeaux, wants to send money to Saint-Domingue, when they purchase a bill of exchange that then becomes, that can be remitted in Saint-Domingue, they don't have to deposit cash to buy, they just have to give their name and their signature. So it is an economy of reputation. And this economy of reputation involves assessing the potential solvency and competence of people in a technological world in which there are no credit scores. And so people make judgments about how credible a potential borrower is on the basis of a combination of facts, maybe because they see him going to the market or to the bourse or to the docks every day and they know how much he's transacting, but they cannot inspect his books. And they make also a lot of assumption on the basis of how this person is presenting himself, and being Jewish or not being Jewish, being dressed in a certain way, being drunk or sober. There are all sorts of social elements that enter in the valuations of this social reputational, economy. I don't think our modern world is completely, these elements are completely absent. We know that there are some in-group economies that work because people think or have real information based on other elements. We know that there's a lot of discrimination, say in labor markets or in mortgage lending, It's very documented. There are elements that transcend the actual credit scores of individuals, but that other individuals, because of the race or ethnicity, that have been discriminated against from mortgage lenders, mortgage companies. So it's not completely absent, but in the pre-modern period, it was inevitable that preconceptions and quick judgments would fit into this reputational economy, because the ability to actually ascertain the assets and the values that somebody had was almost impossible. So in this reputational economy, images of Jews loom very large. And one of the things I try to do is to link this economic history to this cultural history. And this financial credit economy based on reputation tells us that the two things are not really separate. The religious ideas and the most intricate technical details about how the economy worked went hand in hand, because things were difficult to ascertain, and therefore cultural presumptions had more of a weight.
Right. Okay. So, I say this often in a lot of these podcasts. I say, we were discussing a lot of this, but there's so much more in the book. But here it's really true. It's like 400 pages. That includes the footnotes, but the endnotes. But there's really a lot going on. Appendices. There's a lot in the book. And if in this topic it'll interest you, should check out the book in the link. So one thing I want to just, I think you kind of mentioned this, but just to emphasize that. So Cleirac, if I'm not butchering his name, he's where you found as the original source, and then the other manual that I don't recall the name, is the one that you later on found that kind of spread it, that kind of, I guess, spread the legend. So he was the original source, and then it got spread from him throughout. So what happened to the legend eventually? As you say, first of all, it was a legend. It's not true, and then not only that, which we should get to also, but just for a second, what happened later on as it petered out?
Well, as you said, there are many layers to the story I'm trying to convey, but I think I hope I've made clear of how powerful this association between Jews and bills of exchange, and therefore between financial abstraction and religious fears was. And precisely because this association was so powerful, this legend had an incredibly long afterlife. So not only was it spread a lot, but in 1690, less than 50 years after it first was disseminated in print, somebody wrote to say that this legend was false. But it says it's not false because the source that is quoted is wrong, but because it makes no sense. So it criticizes this legend on the basis of its internal coherence to the story. And this author is completely right, and yet barely makes a dent in the afterlife of this legend. And I think that resonates with our own times, and this is where I betray my own personal views, in which completely this completely wacko ideas about Jews using lasers to control the economy, or things that are really medieval in quality, stick. Right. And there's the idea that Donald Trump may have won the elections. It's just not true, but it's not easy for a lot of people to let it go. So the fact that something is implausible, at the very least, sadly today in our very modern world, we know that it's not enough to make that implausible idea to go away. So the legend went on because of its symbolic power, not because it was true, let alone plausible. Somebody as famous as Montesquieu, the French philosopher and authors of The Spirit of the Laws, a very important Enlightenment work of 1748, reworked the legend in a less anti-Semitic way. He actually had more praising words for the Jews, but he was so authoritative that he contributed to spread this idea. Throughout the 19th century, Marx, who, as many of our listeners probably know, was the grandson of a rabbi and son of a Jew who converted together with the family, but he was Jewish. Also hints at this legend. Werner Sombart, the very anti-Semitic German writer, author of the 1911 book, Jews and Economic Life, translated into English, Jews and Capitalism, though that was not the German title. He gives a very anti-Semitic new twist to this legend, as I said, as late as 1911. So this legend has a very long afterlife. It is only after World War II that a number of academic scholars finally nail the point that this is not true. And then the topic kind of falls out of fashion, in part because after World War II, because of the Shoah, because of the violent link between ideas of Jews and the economy and the extermination of European Jews. In Jewish history, there's been for a long time in the second half of the 20th century, some reluctance to even touch these topics because they're so complicated and fraught, really fraught. And as time has passed from the 1990s and early 2000 onwards, there is more academic interest in Jewish economic life of the past, which is so sort of my book is in part in conversation with a number of other scholars, and I think it's an important development that we can now unearth new complicated facets of this very long and intricate history. Although, as you said at the beginning of this conversation, the very violent repercussions around us are, fortunately not of that magnitude, but these ideas still percolates and have consequences, and people act violently on the misguided belief in some of these ideas, and the way in which, say, images of George Soros have been deployed in Hungary, for example, shows that these ideas don't have only a life of their own, but have very violent and horrible repercussions. So those of us who are scholars are very aware that as we unearth these ideas, we want to explain also how we should interpret them. This is not to give new admonitions to that kind of anti-Semitic discourse, but precisely to show, and that's very important to me, how both the persistence and the changes in European ideas about Jews and capitalism. Anti-Semitism is not something unchangeable. There's some persistent features, there are persistent themes, but that's why 17th century Bordeaux is a particular moment in time and place. And I think it's very important to capture both sides of this coin.
So I guess that was the purpose of you writing this book, right?
That was, exactly. That was one of them, one of the main purpose was precisely to show how anti-Semitism, which is one manifestation of prejudice that and racism, and there are others, as all forms of prejudice, it's on the one hand very entrenched, and on the other very malleable. And that's what, its protein qualities make it even more dangerous. But we need to understand anti-Semitism in particular historical context. And the particular historical context is the birth of financial capitalism, the birth of abstraction, something that is different from pawnbroking, something that is new and therefore generates new ideas, mobilizes old tropes about Jewish usury, but puts these tropes in the service of a new paper economy and new fears. Anti-Semitism is all about the fears of Christian societies in this case, and its own weaknesses. And it's not about Jews, right? A prejudice is not. It always tells us about the people who hold those prejudice, much more than it tells us anything about the target of prejudice, which are just fictions of the imaginations of those who are unable to cope with the reality of the complexity of their problems, and therefore creates imaginary shortcuts. And those shortcuts are caricatures of reality.
Okay. I just want to, just one thing. So the bills of exchange, you said the legend, I do mention in the book, just listeners are mentioned here. So they were created. Do we know who they were created by, though?
That's a very good question. So ever since, economic historians have devoted a lot of time. So there's not a single individual, and probably not even a single group, who invented these new instruments. But as I said, marine insurance and bills of exchange are both the byproduct of the medieval commercial revolution. They evolved slowly. They're not inventions that somebody devised in their minds from morning to night. They emerge slowly as a process of development in late medieval Italy, perhaps southern France, in these centers of commerce, in these urban hubs where merchants needed to hone their tools the more they got involved in trade. So somewhere between the 13th and 14th century, there is some rivalries between Italian cities. There are those in Genoa, they say we invented them. In Venice, they say we invented them. Florence, this is part, this is just silliness. It could be, it is a process of evolution and imitation. In Marseille as well was linked to these trading routes. So they come from Southern Europe and particularly Italy in the 13th and 14th century, and are a process rather than an invention.
Okay, so I will,
That's a very important point, it's something that has contributed to the illusion of the legend, because it is so unrealistic, but also so wrong that academic scholars stop paying attention to it. And the premise of my book is the fact that an idea is erroneous does not mean that it hasn't had an enormous influence. Sadly, a lot of very wrong ideas about Jews, one thing just about the protocols, have had a very long and influential shadow. And so this particular legend, because it is found in a source that is read mostly by economic historians who don't think very much about culture, and Jewish historians wouldn't read these merchant manuals because they don't think there are things important about Jews to be found there. So it's also an attempt to show how primary sources, documents that do not normally belong to Jewish history, can tell us a lot about at least Christian ideas about Jews that can be found even in the least predictable kind of archival records and manuscripts and library records.
Right, absolutely. So I'll link to the book, as I mentioned. I'll just say it, and it's in a good way. I don't think it's not like a light, read. You put your feet up and read it. But if you find this interesting, it's a really fascinating read. It's very, very interesting. There's a lot of really interesting, like I said, a lot more than we discussed. So I'll link to that in the show's notes, and you can check it out. Also to see what a bill of exchange looks like. And with that, thank you, Professor Trivellato, for coming.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.